Picture this. It's about 40,000 years ago, somewhere in ancient northern Europe, and a small group of ancient humans who migrated out of Africa several thousand years earlier is huddled around a fire in the aftermath of a long, gray winter that showed absolutely zero interest in ending on schedule. These people look noticeably different from their distant African ancestors in ways that go beyond simple clothing choices. Lighter skin that's spent generations absorbing whatever weak northern sunlight was available, and among the children scrambling around the fire's edge, a range of hair colors that would have looked genuinely unusual to any ancient African human who'd somehow materialized to observe it. A couple of the children have hair so light it's almost the color of dry grass. One has something distinctly reddish about it. The others range across various shades of brown that their ancestors would have found exotic, given that essentially every ancient human in Africa for the previous 100,000 years had been working with some variation of very dark brown to black. Nobody in this group has any idea why their hair looks the way it does. Nobody has any concept of genetics, pigmentation, melanin, or ultraviolet radiation. What they have is a set of visible physical differences that function, as physical differences always have in human populations, as information, markers of family, markers of group membership, markers of whatever meaning their specific culture had developed around these visible variations over the generations they'd been living with them. The genetics that produced these hair colors was running quietly in the background of their lives, completely invisible and completely uninvited, doing things that wouldn't be understood for another 40,000 years. So here's what this video is going to do. Properly, specifically, and honestly explain why we have different hair colors, what happened in ancient human history to produce the range we see today, which ancient populations developed which variations, and roughly when and what the actual biology underlying all of it looks like. Stick around because this is one of those topics that seems simple on the surface and turns out to connect to some genuinely fascinating deep history about ancient human migration, adaptation, genetics, and the surprisingly complex biology of something as apparently mundane as the color of your hair. Let's start with the biology first, because you can't understand the history without understanding the mechanism. And the mechanism is genuinely interesting in ways that aren't often explained clearly. Hair color is determined primarily by melanin, a pigment produced by specialized cells called melanocytes located in hair follicles. But here's the thing most people don't know. There aren't dozens of different pigment types producing all the different hair colors you see in the world. There are essentially two: eumelanin, which produces dark colors ranging from brown to black depending on concentration and distribution, and pheomelanin, which produces lighter colors ranging from red to yellow. Every hair color in the entire human spectrum, from the deepest black to the palest blonde to every shade of red, is produced by variations in the ratio, concentration, and distribution of these two pigment types, combined with the structural properties of the hair itself that affect how light interacts with the pigment. Black hair results from high concentrations of dark eumelanin. Dark brown hair has slightly less eumelanin and slightly different distribution. Red hair is the most genetically specific and most interesting case, produced by a version of melanocyte function that produces predominantly pheomelanin with reduced eumelanin, creating the distinctive warm orange-red appearance that's been both celebrated and occasionally mocked throughout human history. Blonde hair involves low overall melanin production of both types, with whatever melanin is present being lighter in tone. The specific genetic variants that determine which version of this melanin production system any given individual inherits are distributed unevenly across global human populations in ways that directly reflect ancient migration and adaptation history. Now let's talk about where this all started, because the baseline is genuinely important. The ancestral human hair color, the color essentially all ancient humans in Africa carried for most of the history of our species, was very dark brown to black, produced by high concentrations of eumelanin. This is still the most common hair color globally by a significant margin, which makes complete sense given that most of human evolutionary history occurred in Africa, and most living humans are descendants of populations that maintained this ancestral pigmentation pattern. The variants producing lighter hair colors, blondes, reds, and lighter browns, are derived mutations, meaning they represent changes from the original ancestral state rather than the original state itself. Understanding when, where, and why these mutations arose and spread tells us something genuinely fascinating about specific episodes of ancient human history. Let's talk about the ancient migration out of of Africa first, because this is the essential precondition for everything else in this story. We've touched on ancient human migration in various earlier videos across this series, but it's worth establishing the specific timeline clearly here because it matters directly for understanding hair color distribution. The major migration of anatomically modern humans out of Africa occurred primarily between roughly 60 and 70,000 years ago, with populations spreading first into the Middle East and then progressively across Asia and eventually into Europe, reaching Europe in meaningful numbers roughly 45 to 40,000 years ago. These migrating populations carried with them the ancestral dark hair color of African ancient humans. The lighter hair color variants we associate with European populations today didn't exist yet, at least not in any significant frequency. They arose after migration, within populations that had settled into specific geographic contexts very different from the African environments that had shaped human pigmentation for most of our evolutionary history, and their spread through those populations was driven by a combination of factors that make complete sense once you understand the environmental pressures those ancient populations were navigating. Let's talk about ultraviolet radiation and vitamin D, because this is the core environmental driver underlying most of the skin and hair pigmentation variation we see across human populations, and it's one of the most compelling examples of natural selection visibly shaping human biology that exists anywhere in the scientific record. Melanin, in both hair and skin, functions primarily as a photoprotective pigment, absorbing ultraviolet radiation from sunlight and preventing it from penetrating deeper tissue layers where it could cause DNA damage. In high UV environments like equatorial Africa, this photoprotection is genuinely crucial for preventing skin cancer and other UV-related damage, which creates strong natural selection pressure for high melanin production. But melanin doesn't just block harmful UV. It also blocks the UV radiation that skin tissue requires for synthesizing vitamin D, an essential nutrient for bone health, immune function, and various other biological processes. In high UV environments, there's so much UV radiation available that adequate vitamin D synthesis occurs even through high melanin skin. In low UV environments like Northern Europe, particularly during long winters with weak, low-angle sunlight, the amount of UV radiation available is already barely sufficient for adequate vitamin D synthesis, even in light-skinned individuals. A high melanin individual in Northern Europe during winter months would be at genuine risk of vitamin D deficiency, which can cause serious health problems including bone deformities, compromised immune function, and complications in pregnancy and infant development. This creates exactly the kind of directional selection pressure that produces rapid pigmentation change in populations that have migrated from high UV to low UV environments. Individuals with genetic variants producing slightly lower melanin concentrations in their skin and hair would synthesize vitamin D more effectively in the low UV northern environment, surviving winters better, having healthier pregnancies, raising more surviving children, and progressively shifting the population's average pigmentation toward lighter tones over many generations. This process, operating across the roughly 40,000 years that ancient human populations have been living in Northern Europe, is the primary driver of the lighter hair and skin pigmentation, characteristic of European populations today. Now, let's address red hair specifically, because it deserves dedicated attention as the most genetically distinctive and most specifically interesting case in the entire human hair color story. Red hair is produced primarily by variants of a gene called MC1R, which encodes a receptor protein that normally directs melanocytes toward producing dark eumelanin. Certain variants of this gene reduce or alter this signaling function, causing melanocytes to produce predominantly pheomelanin instead, resulting in the characteristic red-orange pigmentation combined with the very light skin and increased freckling that typically accompanies it. Red hair variants in MC1R appear to have emerged in Europe somewhere between 40 and 70,000 years ago, and their current distribution, highest frequency in Scotland and Ireland, decreasing progressively moving south and east across Europe, tells an interesting story about ancient population movement and isolation. The highest concentration of red hair in the specific northwestern corner of Europe suggests these variants achieved their highest frequencies in populations that experienced particular geographic isolation in that region, with the genetic drift effects of small, isolated populations amplifying the frequency of these variants well beyond what natural selection alone might have produced. This is a genuinely important point worth expanding on, because natural selection acting on hair color isn't the only evolutionary force shaping the global distribution we see today. Genetic drift, The random fluctuation in gene frequencies that occurs in small populations can amplify certain genetic variants to high frequency purely by chance without any selective advantage, particularly when populations pass through bottlenecks of small size that amplify the effect of random sampling. Ancient European populations, particularly in the early settlement of northern and western regions, were relatively small, isolated groups where genetic drift could produce substantial changes in variant frequencies across just a few generations, potentially explaining patterns of hair color distribution that don't map cleanly onto the vitamin D selection pressure story. Let's talk about blonde hair specifically and its remarkable concentration in Scandinavian and Northern European populations, because this has its own interesting genetic and historical story. Blonde hair involves a different genetic architecture from red hair, produced by multiple genetic variants across several genes that collectively reduce overall melanin production, rather than redirecting it toward pheomelanin the way red hair variants do. The specific combination of variants producing Scandinavian-type blonde hair appears to have become particularly common in Northern European populations through a combination of the vitamin D selection pressure we discussed and what some researchers have proposed as potential sexual selection effects within specific ancient populations that developed cultural preferences for this relatively rare, highly visible variant. There's something genuinely interesting about the sexual selection hypothesis here that connects directly to themes we've explored across this series. Specifically, our ancient attractiveness video. We established there that personal appearance carried significant social signaling value in ancient human groups, and that visible, unusual physical traits could function as meaningful markers of individual identity, group membership, and sometimes status. A highly distinctive, highly visible physical trait like very light blonde hair would have been immediately recognizable within a population where it existed, providing a salient marker that could be incorporated into whatever social signaling system the specific ancient culture had developed around visible physical differences. Whether ancient humans in Northern Europe actively preferred blonde hair in mating choices in ways that accelerated its spread is genuinely debated, but the possibility is consistent with everything we know about how ancient humans incorporated visible physical differences into their social and reproductive lives. Let's address something genuinely fascinating here regarding the timeline of when specific hair color variants became common in European populations, because ancient DNA research over the past decade has produced some genuinely surprising results that complicate the simple story most people assume. Researchers analyzing ancient DNA from European skeletal remains spanning the period from roughly 40,000 years ago to the arrival of agriculture in Europe have found that the light hair and skin variants so strongly associated with modern European populations today were not as prevalent in ancient European hunter-gatherer populations as you might expect. Some of the oldest ancient European skeletal remains, dating to around 40,000 years ago, show genetic profiles suggesting these earliest European inhabitants still carried relatively dark pigmentation variants despite having been in Europe for many generations. The strong increase in light hair and light skin genetic variants appears to have occurred relatively recently in evolutionary terms, apparently accelerating substantially within the last 10,000 years, possibly driven by population mixing between different ancient European populations with different pigmentation profiles, dietary changes associated with the transition toward agriculture, or some combination of demographic and selective factors that researchers are still working to fully understand. This genuinely surprised the research community when ancient DNA analysis first revealed it clearly, because it means the high frequency of light hair in modern European populations isn't simply the result of 40,000 years of gradual change since first European settlement, but reflects a more complex pattern of change that involved significant demographic upheaval across the relevant time period. Let's talk about hair color variation in other parts of the world, because the story of human hair color diversity isn't exclusively a European story, and other populations show interesting hair color variation with their own specific histories. Certain populations in Australia and Melanesia, geographically far from Europe, carry specific genetic variants producing naturally blonde hair that are completely different from the European blonde variants. A striking example of what geneticists call convergent evolution, where similar visible outcomes are produced by different underlying genetic routes in populations that have been genetically isolated from each other for tens of thousands of years. This Australian and Melanesian blonde hair likely reflects similar selective pressures acting on different available genetic variation in those specific populations, potentially including some combination of vitamin D-related selection and genetic drift in isolated island populations, producing a similar visible outcome through a completely different molecular pathway. The existence of blonde hair in geographically isolated Pacific populations with no recent European ancestry definitively demonstrates that this hair color wasn't some unique European invention, but rather a convergent adaptation that arose independently when similar environmental and demographic conditions were met in different parts of the world. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's address something genuinely important about how ancient humans themselves experienced and related to hair color diversity within their groups and between groups, because this connects to themes we've explored across multiple earlier videos in this series. We've established that ancient humans were deeply, actively aware of physical appearance and its social significance, that they invested real effort in personal adornment and appearance management, and that visible physical differences between groups carried genuine social meaning that was actively interpreted and incorporated into how different groups related to each other. Hair color being one of the most immediately visible physical characteristics and one that varies significantly both within groups and between populations, almost certainly carried social meaning in ancient contexts that went well beyond simple aesthetics. Within groups, distinctive hair color could function as a memorable individual identifier, making specific individuals immediately recognizable and providing a salient anchor for individual reputation and relationship memory. Between groups, systematic hair color differences could serve as population markers, providing immediate visual information about group membership that was relevant to the complex, often wary intergroup relationships we've documented throughout this series. The cultural meanings ancient humans attached to specific hair colors almost certainly varied enormously across different populations and different time periods, shaped by whatever broader cultural framework each specific ancient group had developed for understanding visible physical variation. We have genuinely no way of knowing what any specific ancient population thought about hair color in any specific cultural sense, since these meanings were transmitted orally and have left no direct recoverable trace. But the general pattern of ancient humans actively incorporating visible physical differences into social meaning making, which is amply documented across everything from personal ornamentation to burial practices, makes it essentially certain that hair color was embedded in social meaning in ancient contexts rather than being treated as a meaningless, purely random variation. Let's also address something genuinely interesting here regarding the relationship between hair color and other pigmentation traits that often co-vary, because this is relevant to understanding the full picture of why ancient populations in different environments ended up with different visible appearances. Hair color, skin color, and eye color are genetically partially correlated, meaning some of the genetic variants affecting one tend to affect the others, though the correlation is imperfect, and the traits are independently variable to a meaningful degree. The general pattern of lighter hair, lighter skin, and lighter eyes co-occurring at higher frequencies in Northern European populations reflects the shared underlying biology of melanin reduction, affecting multiple pigmented tissues simultaneously, rather than 3 separate, independent adaptations producing 3 separate coincidentally correlated changes. This partial co-variation means that ancient human populations adapting to low UV environments weren't independently evolving lighter hair, lighter skin, and lighter eyes as 3 separate processes. The same fundamental changes in melanin biology were affecting all 3 simultaneously, with some individual variation in which specific traits lightened more or less depending on which specific genetic variants happened to be present in any given individual or population. Understanding this as a coordinated shift in underlying melanin biology, rather than 3 separate independent adaptations, helps make sense of why these traits cluster together geographically in the patterns we observe across living human populations today. Let's bring this back around to our opening scenario, those ancient children scrambling around a fire in Northern Europe 40,000 years ago. Some with pale blonde hair, one with a reddish tinge, others across a range of lighter browns that their distant African ancestors would have found entirely foreign. Based on everything we've actually covered here, the hair they were carrying wasn't random noise or simple luck. It was the visible outcome of thousands of years of evolutionary history, demographic accidents, migration patterns, and the constant, patient, completely uncaring process of natural selection, working on whatever genetic variation happened to be present in each generation. Their blonde and red and light light brown hair was, in a very real sense, a record of the journey that had brought their ancestors from equatorial Africa to the gray, vitamin D scarce winters of northern Europe, written in the specific pigmentation machinery of each hair follicle, and transmitted forward to every subsequent generation in an unbroken, slowly changing genetic chain that eventually produced everyone with light hair alive in the world today. Those children had no idea their hair was carrying this information. They were just children by a fire, probably arguing about something trivial and showing absolutely zero interest in evolutionary biology. So why do we have different hair colors? Based on the two melanin type system underlying all human hair color variation, the ancestral dark hair of ancient African populations reflecting high UV protection demands, the directional selection toward lighter pigmentation in ancient populations migrating into low UV northern environments, where vitamin D synthesis became the limiting factor, the specific MC1R variants producing red hair reaching high frequencies through a combination of selection and genetic drift in isolated northwestern European populations, the independent evolution of blonde hair in geographically isolated Pacific populations demonstrating convergent evolution through different genetic pathways, the complex demographic history of European populations revealed by ancient DNA research showing more rapid recent change than previously assumed, and the partial co-variation of hair, skin, and eye color reflecting shared underlying melanin biology rather than three separate adaptations. The honest answer is that human hair color diversity is a map of ancient human migration and adaptation written in pigment. Every hair color you see in the world today traces back to specific ancient populations in specific ancient environments, navigating specific survival challenges that shaped the genetics their descendants carry. The diversity we see is neither random nor meaningless. It's the accumulated record of where ancient humans went, how long they stayed, what challenges those environments imposed, and how evolution responded across thousands of generations of patient, invisible change. You're not just a person with a specific hair color. You're the current endpoint of a specific ancient migration route, carrying in your follicles the accumulated pigmentation history of every generation that preceded you all the way back to ancient humans who, for a very long time, all had essentially the same very dark hair and had absolutely no idea any of this was about to change.